This week we're going in focus on redistricting in North Carolina. The redistricting process is always full of back and forth in the General Assembly, and this year it's expected to be no different. On top of the usual work of redrawing the lines, according to the census, North Carolina has grown substantially in the last decade, which means we're picking up a new congressional district, which also means a congressional map could look very different. Joining me now are two legislators who figure to play key roles in the drawing of the new legislative map, Senate Minority Leader Dan Blue and Representative Destin Hall, a Republican and the chair of the House Redistricting Committee. I want to thank you both so much for coming. I think anytime we talk about redistricting, we all just take a deep breath when we start thinking about it. Let's start with you, Representative Hall. I think the question on everybody's mind this year as we're going into this process is, what is it going to look like? How are we going to go about this process of drawing maps this time?
Well, Loretta, thanks for having us on. I think it's an important topic that we need to be talking about for our constituents. As far as what the process is going to look like this time around, the committee hasn't met yet, so all of that is still yet to be decided. I chair redistricting in the House, and I can tell you that one of my goals is that we have an open and transparent process, that we take a lot of public comment, that we listen to that comment and try to implement some of those things in the maps that we ultimately draw, and do all that in a timely way that allows us to still have our filing dates as they currently are set.
Senator Blue, you worked really closely with Senate Republicans the last time. We had a completely different redistricting process the very last time we did redistricting. You seem to be pleased with the way that was done that time. Is that true?
Yes, it was a much more open process, much more collaborative, and I think it gave a great deal of transparency to the entire redistricting effort. Of course, ultimately, I'm hoping that North Carolina moves to an independent redistricting system. It is tough for those who are affected by redistricting to be totally objective in doing it. But the last time in the Senate, we played it much, I think, closer to how it should be. We let the public have meaningful access. They saw everything that we did. It was in the open. They heard the discussions among members. And it was just so refreshing to do it way differently than we had done it the first three times from the 2011 cycle. So I'm hoping a lot of that will be incorporated into the process this time.
Okay, Representative Hall, we do not have a good track record here in North Carolina of these maps making it for 10 years. This is not just the last 10 years. This dates back prior to Republicans being in charge, that we seem to go to court all the time over these maps. As Senator Blue just said, there's often these cries for an independent commission. Do we need that in North Carolina?
Well, Loretta, I think that our legislators are equipped to draw these maps just as we've always done in this state. But instead of focusing on the politics of it and on partisan election data, what we should focus on is keeping our counties whole, keeping municipalities as whole as we possibly can, keeping communities of interest together. And in fact, in 2019, for the first time in the history of this state, the Republican-led legislature drew maps without using any election data whatsoever. We didn't have any data drawing those maps. We were just trying to keep counties whole, municipalities together as best we could, keep precincts together. We drew those maps, courts upheld those maps, and the net result, of course, was the voters of this state sent back Republican majorities in each chamber.
Senator Blue, we often hear, the maps are drawn so politically, whichever party is in charge, you're going to see more districts for that party. I'm going to look back to election night of last year when I was looking at the map as results were coming in for statewide races, and the vast majority of that map was red with blue areas, within the city districts. So the fact that we have more Republican districts right now seems to line up with what our voters are in the state. Are we drawing maps too politically?
We are. It enters too much into it. And I will say that the last redistricting that we completed in 2019 was done under or at the direction of the courts and sort of under the supervision of the courts as to what had to be involved and not a heavily partisan political gerrymander. And so the House adhered to that requirement as well as the Senate. But now, we're starting from whole cloth. And as we redesign, there is no controlling court case that incorporates what the court told us what we had to do in 2019. So I'm hoping that we learn our lessons from that, and that as we start the 2021 redistricting cycle, that we'll incorporate the instructions that the state court, North Carolina 3-judge panel court, gave us as to what had to be involved in nonpartisan redistricting. Yeah, hopefully we learn from the lessons, and I think that why I think that an independent redistricting commission or some process like that would work better is that we wouldn't have the temptation to run off into these political territories. It's just naturally a human trait that we would do that if we're drawing maps that affect ourselves. And so an independent redistricting commission would not be looking at it from how it affects their specific representative or senator, but mostly from the standpoint of compactness, whether it really does do these things that Justin's talking about it should do, that is communities of interest, not splitting geographical units, not cracking or packing, the federal issues involved in redistricting.
Representative Hall, to be honest, the party in charge, I would assume when you're drawing a map, you'd like to see the incumbents be able to keep their seats. Is that the type of information? I know later on in the show we're going to be talking to some of these independent commissions that are out there across the country, and they don't take that into consideration. There were conversations about that. You know, we often have those conversations. Should that be considered?
Well, there's any number of traditional redistricting criteria that should be considered, but the more fundamental issue is the fact that the Constitution requires our legislators in North Carolina to go in and draw these maps. And the problem with an independent commission is that it sounds good, but if you think about it, somebody's got to serve on that commission. And who decides who gets to serve on that commission? Many of the bills that I've seen filed by some of my friends on the Democratic side in the General Assembly have conveniently given the governor the majority of the appointments on this commission, which in my opinion doesn't make it independent at all. It may make it independent from the General Assembly, but it's still a partisan body, because where are you going to find these people who absolutely have no interest in politics at all? They're just going to go in, they're not going to know anything at all about the politics of what they're drawing. It simply doesn't exist. And that's why the better method is to use criteria that doesn't take into account partisan election data. Keep counties whole, keep municipalities whole, try not to split precincts. If you do all those things, you come up with a map that makes sense. You don't get these squiggly lines. You don't get the district that runs from Durham all the way down to Gastonia. Mm-hmm. Those things will not be a part of a map that adheres to those core principles.
Well, sitting here right now, it sounds like both of you are pretty much on the same page about how this should look. It'll certainly be interesting to see how this process turns out once we actually get into it. I'd like to thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Loretta.
And while it can seem like a hectic process, there is a science to redistricting, and it's something that has been studied for decades. You talk with experts who have devoted years to the topic and even helped states to redraw their maps. We're going to be right back.